Thanks very much, Mike.
Or,
Okay, so I'll talk fairly briefly because I think with this particular audience, it's probably more useful to have questions and a discussion than it is just to listen to me. Mike asked me to introduce myself briefly. My name is Michael Dougan. I work at the University of Liverpool. I'm a researcher on EU constitutional law with a particular specialism in the legal relationship between the EU and its member states, which obviously until fairly recently included the UK, but no longer does. But my main focus is EU constitutional law and EU member state relations. Okay, I'm just going to talk fairly briefly then about sort of where we are at the minute from my perspective. And I think probably the obvious starting point which it really is worth focusing in on is the fact that really a policy which was only a couple of years ago seen as basically a sort of lunatic right-wing fringe, and I think that is a fair description, it's lunatic right-wing fringe, has become the core defining policy of the UK government. And that is, I think, on any kind an extraordinary situation that we find ourselves in, but it is the truth. And what makes it even more extraordinary, of course, is that with every passing day, all of the warnings, all of the problems, all of the challenges that sensible people said were going to be the direct result of this lunatic right-wing fringe policy are materializing in practice. And so it's not as if even the warnings aren't there. This is still the route on which this hard right government is determined to proceed. How did we get there? Well, I think it's probably useful to contrast the position that Theresa May had proposed with that of Boris Johnson for life after the transition period. But let's maybe start just by mentioning, of course, the nature of the transition period that we're currently living in. The withdrawal agreement that was signed between the EU and the UK is based on this really fundamental distinction between life during transition and life after transition period. The UK did leave the EU, of course, in January of this year. It is now a third country outside the EU. But for a period of time, the idea was that nothing in particular would change. In fact, for the vast majority of purposes, life would feel exactly the same as before. For the state, for individuals, for businesses, for private sector, public sector authorities, and so on. And really the only major change during transition is that the UK simply no longer participates in the institutions of the EU. It has no voting rights, it has no institutional power, no institutional say. But the idea was to give a period of time during which nothing would change while work continued to prepare for the full and proper consequences of Brexit. But it's really at the end of transition that the full consequences of leaving the EU will begin to materialize. That's true, and we tend to focus, of course, almost entirely on EU-UK relations, and it is true, of course, that the biggest change of all will be in the relationship between the EU and UK. But it's also true of the UK's relations with the rest of the world. We are going to find that hundreds of international agreements with virtually every other country on the planet will also disappear at the start of January. We're going to find that our situation and relationship and our diplomatic and political bargaining power with a whole range of countries changes extensively in January. But it's also true, and we can't stress this enough, internally as well, of course, where an entire range of other new policies and institutions and bodies and situations are going to emerge in January, which were fundamentally different from before. So the big event in leaving the EU was not the 1st of January, or the 31st of January, rather, 2020. The big event in leaving the EU is going to be the 1st of January, 2021. Now, against that background of the transitional period, let's focus in then on what Theresa May had in mind for what should happen at the end of transition. And Theresa May's, we have to draw a distinction, I think, between what Theresa May had on paper and what was actually going to happen in practice. Now, on paper, Theresa May was proposing a relatively distant future relationship between the EU and the UK. We'd be leaving the customs union, we'd be leaving the single market. On paper, a relatively distant future relationship between the EU and the UK. But in reality, in actual fact, Theresa May's plans were not as they appeared to be. Because of her commitment to Northern Ireland, or rather, I should say, if we're being accurate, to the DUP, but because of her commitment to Northern Ireland and the backstop provisions of her withdrawal agreement, in practice, the UK was actually going to remain relatively close to the EU in a whole range of policy fields for the foreseeable future. So there was a real divergence between what Theresa May's rhetoric was and what her paper deal said, and the actual reality that for quite some time to come, and of course a range of activities, the UK was going to remain relatively close to the EU in some respects. And moreover, she did specifically request that the transition period should include a power of extension for either 1 or 2 extra years, so as to give the EU and the UK time to work out more details about what leaving actually meant and how their future relationship should evolve. So that was what Theresa May had in mind. Now, Boris Johnson, by contrast, his entire plan after usurping power, Boris Johnson's entire plan was quite different. First of all, ditch Northern Ireland. Simply ditch Northern Ireland. It's no longer a factor or a consideration in his calculations. And so in practice, Northern Ireland effectively is now a detached part of the UK, even more detached than it was before. Depending on your perspective, that might be a good thing or a bad thing, but it's a simple statement of fact. Northern Ireland will be effectively detached from the rest of the UK. And more importantly, Northern Ireland will be acting as a guinea pig for Boris Johnson's rather peculiar customs and regulatory arrangements, which he has imposed upon Northern Ireland so that he can pretend that he hasn't actually ditched Northern Ireland, that he can keep up the pretense that Northern Ireland is still being treated like a full part of the UK. Simply a crap deal for Northern Ireland on virtually every count. But that was the first stage, ditch Northern Ireland, because that was the problem that was keeping him from pursuing his real objective, which is to have a genuinely distant relationship between the EU and the UK, not just on paper, but genuinely distant relationship between the EU and the UK. We hear a lot in the media, we hear a lot in political debate about, will there be a deal, will there be a no deal, how are the trade talks going, what's going to happen? You're just going to have to take my word for it. We can talk about it more in questions if you want, but you'll just have to take my word for it. People like me are basically saying, have been saying for a while and continue saying it, there is effectively no difference between Boris Johnson's deal and no deal at all for the great majority of purposes, actors, sectors, authorities, individuals in this country. For the great majority of purposes, what Boris Johnson is proposing and asking for is so unambitious, so low level, that there may as well be no deal at all. Moreover, Johnson, of course, as we know, has simply ruled out any extension of the transition period. So he said when he stood for the general election in December 2019, he enshrined it in legislation afterwards, and he stuck to his position, probably the first time in his life that the man has actually told the truth and carried through on his word. But he said he would not extend the transition period under any circumstances. And that, of course, is what we're heading for. Now, from the point of view, I suppose, of EU-UK relations, not extending the transition period is almost neither here nor there. If we accept the proposition that Boris Johnson's deal isn't actually that great, worth that much, even if he managed to convince the EU to have a deal, it wouldn't actually make that much difference. Therefore, logically, neither does extending the transition period make that much difference either from the perspective of EU-UK relations. Where the refusal to extend the transition period does have a big impact, of course, is in two other fields. And the first field is the UK's internal preparations for Brexit, for the full consequences of Brexit in January. Now here, of course, we know from watching the news that, they've just about passed their immigration legislation because they didn't have that at the start. They're still working on their agriculture and fisheries legislation. That's not even in place yet to have a fully functioning agriculture or fisheries policy. We know that they're scrambling to get their border plans together and coming up with all sorts of ideas to try and not have to enforce a border because they're not going to be in a position to do it. But from my point of view, probably the most important development which we're going to see over the next few weeks is the solution in inverted commas, that they're effectively going to impose upon Scotland and Wales that will simply ride roughshod over the devolution settlements and probably bring one step closer the idea of independence in Scotland, maybe even push the Welsh in the same direction. Boris Johnson really couldn't care less about anyone outside his own circle of narcissists. So the internal consequences of not extending transition are actually more important than the issue of UK-EU relations, because suddenly problems, major policy and constitutional problems that we thought there might be another year or 2 years to sort out, have to be sorted out by January. And there's no choice about that. They simply have to be sorted out by January. The other major factor, of course, is the virus, because it's very obvious to any rational thinking human being that if you really are going to carry out a complete and fundamental change in the way that your country is run and its situation in the world and its trade relations with its closest partners and its security arrangements and so on, that it's probably a good idea not to do it in the middle of the most serious public health and economic crisis the world has seen for 100 years. Again, Johnson simply doesn't seem to care about that. He either doesn't believe that this is a problem, or he simply doesn't care about the consequences. But if we cast our minds back to September of 2019, you might well remember the publication, forced publication of the government's no-deal Brexit plan for the likely consequences of what would happen in the event of a serious rupture in EU-UK trade relations of precisely the sort that we're now heading directly for in January. Now, that document talked about problems in securing fresh food supplies, problems in securing medicines and medical supplies, sudden and significant price rises for basic commodities such as energy, disproportionate impacts upon people on low incomes, the threat of social instability and civil disorder. And they were listed as some of the main potential, likely, not just potential, but likely consequences of a serious rupture in EU-UK relations. Now, we're only several months down the line from there. The government's attention has been completely absorbed by the pandemic. I suppose the question which I've been asking for a while now is, how has the government updated those planning assumptions? By the way, there's no evidence whatsoever that the government has updated those planning assumptions at all. In fact, we're not aware that the government has carried out any particular impact assessments of what you do when you pile a no-deal Brexit on top of a coronavirus pandemic crisis. So in a way, the transitional period's expiry was less to do with EU-UK relations, which were already set on a course of a serious rupture in economic and security arrangements, and more to do with internal preparations of the UK itself, and the idea that we're just piling one crisis on top of another without really knowing or understanding what the full consequences might be. And I suppose I'll wrap it up there. I mean, I'll sort of close where I started, but Brexit was project, you know, it was never anything but a hard right project. And of course you have some of the loons who thought that it was going to lead to a socialist revolution or whatever. Brexit was only ever a hard right project. I suspect that even its greatest advocates and exponents are genuinely surprised and amazed at just how much of a hard right project it is turning out to be. I think it probably surpasses even the expectations of many of the loony leavers who originally planned for all this in the first place. The question for you lot, I suppose, is what are you going to do about it? Because that's probably your responsibility rather than mine. But on that happy note, I'll bring Mike back in, I suppose, if he's around, and maybe we can have some questions.
I am around, yes. Thanks for that excellent, as ever, summary of the horrendous situation that we're in. And it is horrendous, particularly when it's all laid out like that, kind of blow by blow. Very clearly, it's a very good, but also quite depressing reminder of our plight, and indeed the ticking clock down to the end of December. So let's take questions. To ask questions, if you can, use the raise hand tool, which is on the participants tab. that would be the best way to do it. Otherwise, you can put a message in the chat if you would rather type your question rather than ask it personally. And we'll take a couple at a time, and then give Michael a chance to answer them rather. So if we could start off with Michael Farmer.
Oh, hi. Thanks very much. The No Deal readiness report that you referred to, published in October 2019, provided for significant role in the localities for the local resilience forums, of which there are 43. I wrote to my local resilience forum in Gloucestershire asking what their plans were, and they told me that they were secret. And I wondered whether you had any observations on whether you think that means that they're not telling us, and that because they're so awful, or because they haven't got any.
Great, thanks, Michael. And then I'll take Chris's question as well, and then Michael, if you want to deal with both.
Okay.
So, Chris,
thanks very much indeed. I'm the CLP European Coordinator for the York Labour Party, and one of the things that we've not really understood is what the Labour Party's vision is over the next year or two regarding all sorts of policy agreements and plans that are going to be discussed in the House of Commons. And the key question is this: do we want to, in future, argue for favouring and prioritising all sorts of agreements with EU countries, or do we want to prioritise having agreements with non-EU countries, or are we going to treat everything on merit? And the Labour Party needs to have a stand on this, because when debates happen over government agreements with other countries, we need to know what we're going to support and what we're not going to support and why.
Great, thanks, Chris. Michael, do you want to take both of those?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I'll just sketch down a couple of little notes, because especially the second question I think is quite complicated set of issues. I mean, on the first question, on Michael's question from Gloucestershire, I mean, who knows? Do these reports exist, or are they so awful that they just don't want us to see them? I think that's a general problem with untransparent government, isn't it? And I think that's probably all we can say, where anything else is just guessing, you know. What we do know from the experience of Operation Yellowhammer is that the government denied its existence for quite a long time. And then when they were finally proven that it did exist, they said that it wasn't really that important and wouldn't say anything significant. And when they were finally forced to publish it, we saw that actually it predicted food shortages, medical problems, and civil disorder and rioting. So I have to say, judged by their very own standards of transparency and honesty, I think we deserve to be cynical about the existence, the contents, and the implications of this type of preparation. I think the problem now is that this is all becoming real. You know, not even the Brexit fanatics anymore can say that they're not about to get their way. These problems are real. They do now need solutions. Things have to be done to put them into place. And I suppose again, if we're going to judge by what we can see, the fact that the government constantly still lies about the nature of what will happen with Northern Ireland, and then only a day later will publish a report which contradicts what they've been saying in Parliament for months beforehand, and then simply lie through their teeth again about it until the next report comes out, means that they just don't deserve public trust. Now, it's easy for me to say that, of course, isn't it? But a shocking amount of the public still do trust them, God knows why. On Chris's question, this is a really difficult one, and it's a difficult one, I suppose, for to discuss with a group of Labour Party activists. And I probably should have clarified at the outset what my position is in relation to the Labour Party. I'm not a Labour Party member, but I had voted Labour my entire life. And I must say, I really genuinely thought that I would never vote anything other than Labour for the rest of my entire life. I didn't vote Labour at the last election, but to be honest, in Liverpool, it really doesn't matter what I vote, because every single constituency in Liverpool, I think, votes at least 85% Labour, full stop. So in a way, my own decision not to vote Labour was motivated by a point of principle. Obviously, if I had lived in any other constituency where there was even the slightest chance of a horrible Tory getting in, I would have voted Labour. But in Liverpool, I had the luxury of not making that decision. So I'm going to speak about the challenge facing Labour, I suppose, as a sympathetic outsider who believes that a Labour government is the only civilised way forward for the country as a whole, regardless of whether I'm a member of the Labour Party or not. In a way, Chris's question is about Labour's political positioning, because it's not about real power. Under the Constitution of the UK, this government will sign whatever treaties it wants with whatever third countries it wants, and there is nothing that the Labour Party or indeed anybody else can do about it. This is a royal prerogative, which is effectively vested in Boris Johnson and his government, and he can sign treaties, he can commit the UK in international law without any parliamentary authority or sanction or say-so. The only role of Parliament is to implement those treaties into UK law under threat of placing the UK in direct breach of its international obligations if Parliament doesn't do its job faithfully as the government instructs. And let's be frank, with an 80-seat majority of a group of Tory MPs who've proven themselves to be completely spineless and wanton, he will get his way. So this isn't about Labour genuinely opposing, with any hope of actually achieving results, whatever Boris Johnson's regime wants to do. I think this is more about how Labour positions itself in the public view and in place for the next election. So I think that's the first point. Constitutionally, we're talking here about political positioning rather than genuine opposition to whatever it is that they want to do. I think Labour's position, in a way, is in an odd place, because, you know, the Labour Party, and I'm probably preaching to the converted here, but, you know, Labour is sort of in a very difficult dilemma. The obvious argument for Labour to make is that the UK should remain closely aligned to our closest friends and partners, the other group of major liberal social market democracies in the world, which is the EU, you know, the biggest alliance of liberal social market democracies in the world, of which we were until recently a leading member. And the obvious Labour position is to remain closely aligned to the world's largest alliance of liberal social market democracies at a time when a lot of the rest of the world, and in particular America and China and Russia, are going down a much more authoritarian, anti-liberal, anti-democratic, anti-social market route. That seems obvious, huh? The challenge in that position is the basic challenge which always haunts the soft Brexit argument. So you basically want to have all of the obligations of being an EU member state without any of the influence. And that's the logic of that position, huh? You want to remain closely aligned to the EU because they are your closest allies, but you don't want to be one of them. That effectively means that you're giving up a significant amount of power and influence and leadership in order to protect your interests, but without a voice at the table. That's a difficult political argument to sustain. Its only logical resolution is to push towards rejoining. Yeah? It's the only logical resolution to that problem. So I think in a way, if I were Keir Starmer, if I were thinking about how to position Labour, in a way your dichotomy, Chris, is true. Is Labour going to go for a European future, or is Labour going to go for a non-European future? If it's going for a non-European future, then it has to convince its members, its supporters, its voters, and the electorate at large of suddenly why being a close friend and ally and member of the world's largest alliance of liberal social market democracies is not for the Labour Party. If it does want to remain allied with the rest of Europe, then it has to explain why we shouldn't rejoin and have our seat at the table and our vote and our say and our influence and our leadership. I'm not disputing for a second that that's an incredibly difficult balancing act for Keir Starmer to have to pull off, but it is ultimately the dilemma that I think the Labour Party has to address.
Great, that was very useful, thank you. Right, let's take questions from Terence and Rick, and then after that we've got a bunch in the chat. So Terence, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I've just got a couple of short questions. I wanted to ask, the car industry in Britain will lose access to the integrated European system. I mean, is there any way that it can be saved? And another point, we've relied very much on anti-discrimination EU law so far. I mean, that will be going. Is there any idea what will replace it? Thanks.
Great, thank you, Terence. And then Rick, let's grab your question as well, please.
Thanks. Well, it's a two-part question, and it's a very simple question, really. And thanks, Michael, for your excellent explanation of where we are now. I just wanted to raise the issue of the withdrawal agreement, really. So two questions. One is, what's your view about the likelihood of the Tory government reneging on the withdrawal agreement? And then two, as a follow-on from that, what would be the consequences of them so doing?
Okay.
Great, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, okay. Simple questions with complicated answers, as usual. I'll deal with Terence's question first. I mean, on the first point, what can be done to save the car industry? If I had the answer to that question, I'd probably be making millions out of the car industry rather than giving constitutional talks at 6 o'clock on a Monday evening. The car industry is going to have to adjust to the new realities of the world, and the new realities of the world mean serious disruption to supply chains. But we all know this. We all know that the just-in-time supply chains have been intimately bound up with the customs union and the single market. They've evolved that way over the past 45 years, and now that's about to disappear. It's not just the car industry, of course, it's thousands of other industries as well, which are going to have the same experience. The best analogy, and Mike has probably heard me give this analogy too many times for his own good, but I'll use it anyway. The best analogy I can think of to illustrate what's happening in January is to contrast how we'd normally plan for a single major change in law. What we'd normally do is have a set of deliberations and consultations. We'd normally formulate proposals and test out different scenarios. We'd normally carry out a cost-benefit analysis of the different options available. We'd then put it out to consultation. We'd put it through Parliament. We'd refine it. We'd anticipate the problems. We'd take mitigating efforts to address them. And still, we'd end up making a mess of it and finding that actually we caused even new problems that nobody had foreseen and new consequences that nobody really prepared for. That's what happens when we change one law at a time. Yeah. What we're talking about in January is changing 10,000 laws at a stroke, without any particular consultations, without any particular preparations, without any particular mitigations, without trying to understand the consequences. And nobody, absolutely nobody, knows what the actual effect of that is going to be. Of course, because nobody's been so friggin' stupid as to do something like that before, but still, nobody really understands what the consequences of this are going to be. And it is a bit of the sort of chaos theory about it, you know? The idea that a butterfly flaps its wings in the Pacific and causes a storm over California. We have no idea what will happen when you suddenly and all at once make 10,000 changes to the way that your country is run. How they interact with each other in ways which are totally unforeseen and unpredicted by even the brightest people. So the question, how do we save the car industry, really in a way is a bit of an important but effectively meaningless question, because we have no idea what the actual challenges facing the car industry are going to be when you put together this enormous set of changes all at once. On your second point, anti-discrimination law and what will replace it. So, I mean, I'm sure you know for the time being that the strategy which has been adopted by the May government and then retained by the Johnson government is effectively across most sectors to temporarily freeze the legal position at the end of the transitional period so that EU law will remain UK law until something happens to change it. Now, that's not true, of course, in every sector. Sectors like immigration, agriculture, fisheries, trade, customs, those are all being changed as we speak. But otherwise, the default position is that whatever the law is on the 1st of January 2021 remains the law unless it's changed in due course. So for the time being, the anti-discrimination law will remain on the books. There's no direct plans to change it. But of course, the whole point of leaving the EU is to give the government with a majority in the Commons the power to do whatever it wants, whenever it wants, with nobody to stop it. So anti-discrimination law will be open to change like every other part of UK law after the 1st of January 2021. But it's probably worth highlighting two quick things. First of all, the real added value of EU law in many fields like this isn't so much the substance of the rules, it's usually the remedies and the enforcement. At the risk of a major generalization, UK law is generally quite crap at enforcement. It's not very good at actually holding either public or private sector bodies to account when they break the law. It's all very well to have rules, but if your actual remedies and enforcement powers are not that strong, the rules begin to wither in practice. EU law is very good at remedies and enforcement. EU law is much better at UK law at actually giving individuals the power to challenge the state, to challenge private employers, to challenge corporations, and to actually do something about the enforcement of their rights and obligations. That is disappearing. So even though the rules might be staying the same on the books, the remedies and the enforcement are about to disappear. To give a very important example, it's a basic principle of EU law that if the government infringes your rights, particularly if they do that deliberately or consciously or with some degree of bad faith, you're entitled to compensation for the losses that the government inflicts upon you as a private citizen. Part of the May Johnson legislation was to abruptly, from January of 2021, abolish the obligation of the state to compensate individuals whose rights are breached under EU law. The rights may be the same, but the remedies change really quite significantly. The second quick point to note is, of course, that Northern Ireland is treated very differently in this regard. For those of you who have an interest in Northern Ireland, EU law will remain fully applicable in Northern Ireland, including the remedies under the protocol. So Northern Ireland actually is in a much more favourable position than England, Scotland or Wales in that regard. Okay, hope that answers Terence's question. Coming on to Rick's question then. First of all, the likelihood of the Johnson government reneging on the withdrawal agreement. I think what we've got to do, first of all, is put the withdrawal agreement into perspective. Once we take away the deal, you know, whatever deal Boris Johnson is currently negotiating or not negotiating about the future relationship, there's really only a few bits of the withdrawal agreement which are left. There's the citizens' rights provisions, there's Northern Ireland, and there's the money. And they're really the only three big bits of the withdrawal agreement that have any degree of longevity or significance into the future. Citizens' rights, Northern Ireland, and the money, the divorce bill. It's actually quite difficult to see what Boris Johnson's interest is in abusing millions of people by reneging on the withdrawal agreement when it comes to the protection of EU nationals living in the UK. On the other hand, of course, the UK's track record of treating EU nationals well is abysmal. Way before the Brexit referendum, there were already well-documented cases of how the hostile environment policy of the Cameron government under Theresa May primarily was causing misery to thousands of EU citizens and denying them their rights. And leading to their unlawful deportations. Let's not pretend that the track record pre-referendum was that great either. But basically, that's the first big area where Boris Johnson might decide to renege. But it's difficult to see, A, how much it would make that much of a difference compared to the hostile environment policy, and B, what his own interest would be in doing that. On Northern Ireland, of course, the situation is more serious. Although we're starting to see what the proper plans are for implementing the Northern Ireland Protocol, of course, Boris Johnson is lying about it and holding back at every opportunity. Whether that means he actually plans to renege on it or not, who knows? And then we have the money. Well, actually, a lot of the money has already been paid. And again, it's difficult to know just how much of an interest Boris Johnson can have in the remaining parts of the money which haven't been paid already, withholding them for the sake of what? Because it would be such a clear breach of international law to just simply withhold that money without any justification or rationale whatsoever. So actually, the opportunities for reneging on the withdrawal agreement are relatively discreet and relatively limited. And in each case, the political costs of making yourself an international pariah by openly reneging on basic, clear and binding legal obligations for no particular good reason or advantage mean that it's difficult to see what the incentive is to do it. In terms of the consequences, though, the formal consequences are fairly straightforward. After the transitional period expires, if there is a dispute between the EU and the UK, then in most circumstances, it goes to an arbitration panel, which is set up by the parties under the agreement. But for anything which involves the interpretation of EU law, the arbitration panel has to ask the European Court of Justice. The European Court of Justice doesn't settle the dispute, but it at least tells the arbitration panel what the correct interpretation of EU law is, if that's relevant to the settlement of the dispute between the EU and the UK. If the losing party doesn't comply with the ruling of the arbitration panel, then you can go for escalating the dispute and ultimately look at imposing financial sanctions or suspending parts of whatever agreements exist between the two parties, but that can't affect citizens' rights. Citizens' rights are protected. So even if there was, for example, a dispute between the EU and the UK about the money, the EU couldn't retaliate against the UK by, for example, kicking British nationals out of Europe. They wouldn't be allowed to do that. So citizens' rights are safeguarded and ring-fenced within the agreement, but otherwise, it's effectively a system of international retaliation. So the formal mechanisms are there. It has to be said, not many countries use formal dispute settlement mechanisms under international agreements because they tend to be lengthy and cumbersome and not enormously effective, full of political considerations. Most parties want to try and resolve disputes through negotiation and through amicable agreement. What makes the EU-UK withdrawal agreement very unusual under international law, international relations, is that most of the time when two parties sign a treaty, it's because they want that treaty and they want it to work and they want it on the books. This particular withdrawal agreement is relatively unusual in that Boris Johnson didn't want that treaty, doesn't care about its contents, has no particular incentive to make it work. He only signed it to win his leadership and an election and get himself into power. So it's not a great starting point.
Great, thank you, Michael. Right, we've got a whole bunch of questions in the chat now, so I will have a look at those so I can get them. Right, so a couple of quick ones. Alex says, when and what should we start stockpiling? Eric says, what is your view on the relative silence of the Labour Party on the fate that we're now facing and feasible policy proposals they could be putting forward? And board with Northern Ireland, how will it be managed after January the 1st? Do you want to take those through? And then we'll work down the list as in the time that we've got available.
Another three tiny questions, of course. I'll just get a little piece of paper because I'm running out. Okay, on stockpiling, I'm going to give a relatively flippant answer because obviously it's it's a very complicated question for the reasons we've already discussed. I'll tell you what I've stockpiled, but more out of entertainment than through any utility. I've stockpiled my violin strings because they're all imported from Europe, and I don't want to find myself unable to play the violin because I can't get my hands on the strings anymore, or the price has doubled. The price has already gone up, by the way. There used to be about 40 quid a pack. They've now gone up to 75 quid a pack, and that's due primarily to currency fluctuations where sterling has lost ground against the euro. And of course, what tends to happen is that the currency loses ground, the prices go up, but when the currency regains ground, the prices don't go back down again. Listen, what we said before, this is going to have myriad implications in all sorts of ways for all sorts of things, and we don't really fully understand what the consequences are going to be. I know that a lot of people are wondering whether they should be keeping their eye on their medicines or whether they, the answer is nobody really knows. Nobody really knows, because the consequences of this, changes of this nature, are without historical precedent, and not even the best fortune tellers can work out what the consequences might be. In effect, I'm less worried about the stockpiling than I am about my future ability to do my job properly across the rest of Europe. One of the major consequences for me personally of January 2021 is that I won't have the European health insurance scheme anymore. I won't be entitled to emergency cover if I have an accident while I'm traveling abroad on work or holiday purposes. And given that I travel, but pre-lockdown, I traveled across the rest of the EU probably about once or twice every single month of my entire life. This is a big deal. Yeah? If I have to take out private health insurance, which I will have to do, it only causes additional problems because I have a series of underlying medical conditions, which means that a lot of insurance companies won't give me private health insurance or will charge me a bloody fortune for the privilege. That to me is a major inconvenience, a major cost and a major inconvenience, more significant than violin strings, I suppose, in the big scheme of things. That's the type of problem that we're really going to have to get our heads around. Okay, the relative silence of the Labour Party, what do I make of it? I'm going to be generous given the audience, and Mike has heard me probably say this already as well. I'm going to assume that Keir Starmer is an incredibly intelligent and humane person who is playing a good political game of letting the Tories hang themselves from their own gibbet. It's a risky strategy, I think, for two reasons. First of all, it does alienate people like me. I understand it. I understand why he's doing it. I understand that it's difficult politics for Keir Starmer in general and the Labour Party. The problem is that people like me are not going to vote for a party which is not overtly pro-European, and I couldn't care less what the good politics of it are. There's a point of principle at stake here which is more important than the good politics. So I think Keir has to be worried that he doesn't permanently drive away from the Labour Party somebody like me, and there are tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people just like me, who are natural Labour voters, natural Labour supporters, and yet feel deeply alienated from the Labour Party on this one specific issue. Really what Labour should be doing, I think, is creating the narrative very clearly that everything which is about to happen to this country falls on the shoulders of the Tories and their Brexit. I think that position is much more credible and robust if you're openly opposing the Tories and their Brexit than if you're simply remaining silent and letting it happen. I think it would be so much more convincing if Keir, for example, had argued for an extension of the transition period. They were never going to get it. Yeah? Johnson was never going to give that extension to transition. So I'm not sure what there was to be gained from not opposing it. It would have made the job of saying the Tories did this so much easier, because now the Tories can simply reply, well, Labour agreed with us. Labour said we shouldn't extend the transition either. So whatever's happened, Labour is endorsed. Silence makes a lot of political sense, but I think it also has a lot of political costs. And to me, those are two very obvious political costs of the current relative silence of Labour on Europe. On the question then about the border with Northern Ireland, this is a very big and complicated question. We could spend an hour just talking through the complexity of what's about to happen to Northern Ireland. I'll try and sum it up as quickly as I can. First of all, when it comes to trade between Northern Ireland and the Republic, and indeed the EU as a whole, Northern Ireland is effectively being treated for regulatory purposes as if it were still part of the single market. The big difference is that it's the UK authorities which are going to be enforcing the EU's rules in Northern Ireland. Subject to EU supervision, and some of the EU institutions will still directly exercise their jurisdiction over Northern Ireland, for example, the Commission and respective state aid rules. But by and large, the EU has basically contracted out policing of its own borders to the UK. I think it's fair to say that across the rest of Europe, that is seen as a high-risk strategy, and many people across the EU are not convinced that that is a good idea, because the UK is simply seen as an untrustworthy partner who cannot be trusted to do that job properly and with full effect. And in a way, the office over the argument over the EU office in Belfast, small thing though it may seem in the big scheme of the world, was emblematic of the non-cooperation of the UK authorities in making this protocol actually work in practice. Second issue then is about the relationship between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. Now here, there will be certain trade obstacles going from Northern Ireland to England, Scotland and Wales, certain trade obstacles. The government has promised unfettered access for Northern Ireland to England, Scotland and Wales. In practice, it will not be entirely unfettered. First of all, as a matter of international law, there are certain export restrictions that the EU and Northern Ireland and the UK will have to observe. There are certain categories of goods that when they leave Northern Ireland to enter England must be the subject of various controls and checks and formalities. But that's a relatively small category. The big problem, and it's a problem that the government has still not published any detail on, is how do you distinguish goods from Northern Ireland from goods from the EU travelling via Northern Ireland? Because the Northern Irish goods are entitled to free access to the UK. The EU goods coming from the Republic or anywhere else via Northern Ireland are not entitled to the unfettered access. So you can make this promise to Northern Ireland all you want, unfettered access, unfettered access. The simple fact is they must have a system for distinguishing Northern Irish goods from every other good coming via Northern Ireland. And at the minute, we have no idea what their plans are. More complicated is the situation when it comes to goods going from England, Scotland or Wales to Northern Ireland. Those goods will be fully subject to EU customs and regulatory control. And we know this is in the news, This is in the news all the time. Whatever Johnson lies about, whatever Gove tries to worm his way out of, they will be subject to full EU customs and regulatory control. Now, what that means in practice, I suppose, is that as soon as we start to see, for example, a divergence in the regulatory standards of England versus the EU, then English companies will have to make a choice. Do we want to have a separate production line for Northern Ireland, or do we not? We can guess what happens when you start to say that you need to have 2 production lines for a territory with a population of 1.8 million. That population simply starts to be cut out of the equation, is no longer part of your market calculations. You decide you're not going to manufacture for that market or try to export there. We will see consumer choice drop in Northern Ireland, prices rise, and that's the inevitable impact of trade barriers. But of course, those are trade barriers within the UK, introduced by the Johnson Tory government. But in a way, the most complicated bit of the Northern Irish equation is the question of customs duties. So the whole system works on the basis that all goods entering Northern Ireland from England, Scotland or Wales are presumed to be on their way to the EU and must pay EU customs duties. unless proven otherwise, unless you prove that the goods are going to remain in Northern Ireland and not move off into the Republic. What that means in practice is that they're going to have a system whereby all goods entering Northern Ireland have to pay EU customs duties, which in the case of certain agricultural goods might be 40%. And then if you can prove that your goods have stayed in Northern Ireland, you can apply for a reimbursement of those customs duties. A bureaucratic nightmare, huh? A bureaucratic nightmare, anti-competitive bureaucratic nightmare. I think it's worth bearing in mind that when Theresa May first made this proposal in 2018, Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, all the rest of them squealed their little heads off. This is unworkable, it's anti-competitive, no one could possibly live under such a tyrannical, totalitarian, bureaucratic regime. That's exactly what Boris Johnson imposed upon Northern Ireland under this agreement, exactly the same. The deal which Boris Johnson said was intolerable and unworkable and anti-competitive is exactly what he's imposed on Northern Ireland. So sorry, that's a bit of a long answer to a very simple sounding question. But the simple fact is, as I said before, that Northern Ireland is effectively being treated as a guinea pig. Basically, one of the only places on planet Earth which will have to suffer under a dual customs regime with two distinct regulatory and customs systems applying to exactly the same territory at exactly the same time. And there's a good reason why nowhere else on Earth really does that type of thing, because it's so obviously crap. But that's what Northern Ireland will have to put up with.
Thank you, Michael. So moving on, we've got Lynn's question. What would be in the deal if Johnson was to get one? Good question. Rose's question, is the withdrawal agreement legally binding? And then Catherine's asked two questions. Number one being public opinion shifting very slowly towards recognition of how awful Brexit will be. Voters are becoming more fickle. What level does public opinion have to get to in terms of recognising Brexit as a mistake for Labour to adopt a rejoin policy? You may not know the answer to that one. Second, should we be lobbying the leader, as in Labour leader, I presume, to start putting Johnson on the spot about Brexit planning and the consequences of his approach to get more general publicity about this? You probably do know the answer to that one. Have a go at those three. And thank you so much for keeping going on this, by the way. And then we'll see where we are time-wise after that.
Okay, what would be in the deal if he gets one? The fact is that Johnson isn't going to get the deal that Johnson has asked for, minimal as it is. Yeah, and I'll reinforce that point again. What Johnson is asking for is not a big deal. Effectively, what Johnson is asking for is to have no customs duties on UK goods entering the EU, on EU goods entering the UK. Now, as any international trade lawyer will tell you, customs duties are not the big problem in international trade. Yeah? They're the obvious one, because they're the one that people understand. They're accessible to the public. You want to bring your good into my territory, pay me £100. You know, that's easy. It's an easy problem and it's easy to understand the barrier. It's easy to understand the impact that it has upon competition, upon trade, upon supply chains and so on. That's all that Johnson is interested in. And I have to say, I suspect he's only interested in customs duties because it's the only bit he can actually understand. I suspect that the rest of international trade simply passes this cretin by. But it's not the real problem in international trade. The real problem is about regulatory standards. The real problem is about manufacturing requirements. It's about marketing processes. It's about the relationship between goods and services and the servitization of supply chains in the economy. It's about professional qualifications. It's about regulatory supervision. Those are the big problems of international trade. Those are what membership of the single market is about. So even if Johnson got his way and there were zero customs duties on goods between the EU and the UK, actually it would make almost no difference to having to carry out actual customs checks and paperwork, because you've still got to check that the goods are entitled to zero customs duties. You can't just say, well, in that case, there are no borders. Of course, there are still borders. It's just that you don't have to pay money at the border. But all of the border checks are still there, all of the disruption, all of the issues, all of the problems. But more importantly, customs duties are only a tiny part of the problem. And of course, they're only relevant to trade in goods. They don't apply to trade in services, which is what, 85% of the UK economy. They don't apply to capital movements. They don't apply to establishment. They don't apply to the movement of people. We're only talking about that much of a problem, which is that size. And of course, the reason Johnson isn't going to get that is because he's not willing to sign up to the level playing field commitments. Yeah? He's not willing to commit to observing basic EU standards, and I mean basic EU standards, on the environment, on workers' rights, on consumers' rights, on public health, and so on. Now, Johnson's reply, of course, is, well, we're going to have our own higher standards than the EU, to which the obvious answer is, well, if you're going to keep your own higher standards in the EU, then what's the problem with promising that you're going to match the minimum standards of the EU that you say you want to exceed in any case? The only reason you want a power to diverge from minimum standards is because you want to make them worse, not because you want to make them better. But unless Johnson is willing to sign up to those things, there will be no zero tariffs on trade between the UK and the EU. And how many times does the EU have to say this before Johnson finally gets it? So what's in Johnson's deal if he gets one? The answer is he's not going to get one because he won't sign up to the basic minimum requirements required to get the type of deal that he wants. But even the type of deal that he wants only deals with that much of the problems and disruption of international trade that the single market is meant to address. That's why I say deal or no deal effectively is irrelevant given the Johnson government. It really doesn't matter for the vast majority of people and purposes. Whether there's a deal or not is just irrelevant. Second question then from Lynn, is the withdrawal agreement legally binding? The answer is yes. But I suppose I think it was in answer to Rick's questions about what happens with enforcement. The fact is that the withdrawal agreement only does have this relatively small number of provisions now which have any longevity: citizens' rights, Northern Ireland, the money. And the way to enforce them is through arbitration primarily. And it's not a very effective or it's a very cumbersome and relatively ineffective process. So yes, it's legally binding, but with serious shortcomings in enforcement. The next question then, I sort of scribbled down, public opinion, when will Labour go for a rejoin policy? I really think that's for you lot to decide, not for me. I think I've highlighted what I think is the inherent tension in wanting to remain a leading member of the club of liberal social market democracies without actually being in the club of liberal social market democracies. And by the way, I don't think we should underestimate the damage which the UK's departure has done to that alliance. The UK, for all its faults, was a leading member of the club and was able to champion those values on the world stage, and indeed champion those values within the EU against the likes of Orban and the Law and Justice Party in Poland. The UK's removal from the club has damaged the club as much as it has damaged the UK. In terms of Brexit planning, though, I suppose this really is the dilemma that Labour is going to have to grapple with. When do we move to preparing the public to make the pro-European argument? Do we do it in stages and say, well, we want to have a close relationship with the EU, in which case you've got to have the arguments ready about influence and rule-taking? Or do you just go whole hog and say, this is just such a major mistake, the referendum no longer has any moral or democratic authority, these people had a go, they were given free rein to do as they pleased, and they messed it all up. Now we need to rethink. In which case you're asking about a very big gap between where we are now and where we go in the future. I suppose my contribution to this debate would be more on the constitutional side. The Labour Party also has to find a position on two major issues. single currency, and Schengen zone. And I think that will be, again, an important part of the Labour policy's internal deliberations. What will be Labour's demands in the event of a rejoin policy on joining the single currency and participating in the Schengen area? Those are inescapable questions that Labour is going to have to address if it wants to have a rejoin policy. There are arguments for both, and I can answer questions about them if you want me to, or we can do it some other time or whatever, but they're inescapable. And they will be difficult to have in a public way without the right wing tearing Labour apart on each of those issues.
Why don't you comment briefly on Schengen and the Euro and how that might impact Labour, and then we'll take, given the time, we'll take one more set of questions, and then sadly we'll have to call it a day because there's like 60 questions down there. Okay. Sorry everybody who's asked questions a little bit later than those who started off. Sure.
So you're on Schengen. Sorry?
If you're okay for time for that.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Tony Scales and arpeggios awaiting me after this. Euro and Schengen. So this is the basic problem. Euro is easier to deal with than Schengen, it has to be said. So the expectation is that any country that applies to join the EU will also join the single currency. That was obviously not the case in the past because the UK was already a member state when the single currency was conceived, and the UK negotiated a specific opt-out together with Denmark, a permanent opt-out from joining the single currency. But after that, and the UK governments consistently endorsed this policy, any future country that wants to join the EU must also commit to joining the Euro in due course. Now there's two issues there. First of all, it's not a strict legal requirement, it's just a political expectation. So if the European Council really wanted the UK back in, and one of the deal breakers was not joining the single currency, they could just change the political expectations, yeah? They could change the political expectations. So it's not a strict legal requirement. Secondly, we know from the experience of Sweden that even the strict legal requirement is not actually anything more than a political commitment in the long term. Sweden joined the EU and signed up on paper to committing to join the Euro. No sooner were Sweden in than the Swedish government announced that it would never join the Euro unless there was a national referendum and the Swedish population voted in favour of joining the Euro. So effectively, Sweden has unilaterally said, count us out until we decide otherwise. We call it doing a Sweden in EU law. It's a doing a Sweden. Of course, the UK could do the same thing, but it would be preferable to simply have it in black and white at the outset. We are not committing to join the single currency unless we decide politically that that's what we want to do. But it is only a political commitment. It should be relatively easy to deal with, provided the goodwill is there among the other member states to act that way. Schengen is more complicated because it's actually written into the treaties that any country that asks to join the EU must, as a matter of legal obligation, join the Schengen zone as well as a full member. The only country which now has an opt-out from the Schengen zone is Ireland because of the common travel area with the UK. Now here, although it looks like an insurmountable problem, if you want to rejoin the EU, you must join Schengen. And of course, I'm not making a judgment about whether Schengen is a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just pointing out the political problem. If you did decide you wanted to be back in the EU, but not in Schengen, it's not insurmountable. And the argument is actually very, very simple. The treaties say that Ireland is not part of Schengen because Ireland wants to maintain the common travel area with the UK. If you were to force the UK to join the Schengen zone, you are basically destroying the common travel area for Ireland. In other words, what you've got is a clash of two equal legal provisions. One provision says Ireland has a perpetual right to maintain the common travel area. The other legal provision says new member states must join Schengen. And they are not possible to reconcile with each other. What is the lawyer's obvious answer to that clash of two equally important principles? The one which preserves the interests of an existing member state takes priority over the treatment of a new member state. The UK must have an opt-out from Schengen because that's what Ireland needs in order to respect its common travel area. In other words, Ireland is the saviour of the UK if the UK doesn't want to join Schengen in the future. It's a very simple legal argument. It's very straightforward. It's pretty watertight. It's difficult to argue against it. The problem politically, of course, is that it's a complicated argument to sell to the public. And it's very prone to right-wing populists saying, don't vote to join the EU because it'll give up our borders again and we just got them back. The legal answer is actually relatively straightforward and pretty watertight, but politically, it's a more difficult argument to make. If I were in Labour, I would be thinking about those two problems. I would be using my contacts with the other member states and like-minded political parties and supporters across the rest of the EU to make sure that those two problems were solved in advance rather than having to worry about what the populists do with them in hindsight.
Great, thank you, Michael. Right, one more set of questions, then I'll let everybody go home, including you. So next up, we've got Callie Harris. Lots of good economists claiming that joining the WTO will have adverse effects on the UK economy, as it is not as strong as the government claims. Can you expand on this, as it will be a nail in Boris Johnson's coffin? Populist policies, foreign policy will also have a knock-on effect on the Tory diehards. So essentially, what does WTO mean? Then Catherine, how likely is it that in, say, 2 years' time, when people really have felt the effect of fully leaving the EU, voters will blame Labour for not trying to stop it? And then finally, from Jill, see if this is a question. No, it's not, sorry. Question from Lynn, should Starmer demand a public vote on the deal or no deal? Obviously, he's unlikely to get one, but there we go. We'll leave it there. I will, though, for everyone else, save the chat, and I will, at some point, write as short an email as I can to our mailing list with answers to all the other questions, hopefully. So if you're on our mailing list, look out for that.
Okay. Really good question about the WTO. And again, in an ideal world, this would take an hour to explain rather than a couple of minutes. I think the best way to sum it up, one of my good colleagues at Liverpool, who's a brilliant WTO lawyer, puts it as follows. The EU is what the WTO dreams it could be when it grows up, but it will never become the EU, because it is simply the lowest common denominator of global trade. And that's what the WTO is. It's the lowest common denominator of global trade. We mentioned before, what are the real problems in global trade? Customs duties, that much. Regulatory standards, that much. Professional qualifications, services, The WTO effectively deals with tariffs and a few other minor issues. Yeah? Its level of ambition is incredibly low. It doesn't actually achieve very much because it's the lowest common denominator that every member, which is virtually the entire planet these days, has to sign up to. So the EU is that, the WTO is that. That's in substantive terms. In a way, though, to come back to what we said before, I think in reply to Terence's question about anti-discrimination rules, the real Achilles heel of the WTO, even within its own tiny sphere of responsibility, is in enforcement. Because basically the WTO, as we've seen with the China-American dispute, the WTO is based on a hard-nosed, power-based system of international retaliation. Yeah? And basically, the way the WTO works, the way the EU works is, I've been given a right to sell my goods in France without further checks or problems. What happens if the French decide to impose further checks and problems? I go to a French court and challenge the French government, and I ask for compensation for anything I've lost if they've behaved unlawfully in breach of their treaty obligations. It's a highly individualized system, I have a right to sell my goods in France. If the French breach that right, I ask, as a citizen, as an individual, a French court to vindicate my rights and to provide me with compensation. How does the WTO work? If I can't sell my goods in France as an English exporter or British exporter, Irish resident in British exporter, and the French government do something about it, what do? I have to complain to the UK government that they should initiate a trade war with the French on my behalf. Is that going to happen? Of course not. The answer is, for me as an individual, tough. Unless your government is prepared to initiate an international trade war with the other party, you have no rights under the WTO. These are not about individuals or businesses or citizens or companies. This is about international relations between sovereign powers. More than that, how does the system of retaliation work? Let's say that the UK government did decide that for the sake of Michael Dougan, it was going to initiate a trade war with France. They randomly select groups of French companies and impose destructive tariffs to try and drive them out of business. Yeah? You randomly pick parts of somebody else's country and try and ruin people's lives there to make your political point. It's so inhumane, it's so brutal, it's so anti-human. But that's the way the WTO system works. Yeah? You randomly select parts of another economy and try and destroy people's lives to press your geopolitical point. The third big problem with the WTO is, if that wasn't bad enough, I'm not a big fan of the WTO, by the way. It's a civilizing force in international trade, but it's only a very minor civilizing force. The other big problem, of course, is that Donald Trump is doing everything he possibly can to destroy it. Yeah, as part of his general assault on multilateralism and international institutions, Donald Trump has already rendered the WTO dispute settlement body inoperative. Yeah, it's no longer functioning. Will there still be a functioning WTO if Donald Trump wins a second term? The most horrible thought on earth, I know, but if he wins a second term, will there still be a WTO in 4 years' time is really a matter of great doubt. So just to sum up, very limited substantive ambition, very limited enforcement capacities, deeply unjust. Anybody who is a committed left of center or more than left of center should not be thinking that the WTO is some paradise on earth. Quite the opposite. It's a really problematic institution. But in any case, it's falling apart like everything else under the pressure of the right-wing populists. Will people blame Labour for the consequences of the Tory disaster? I don't think it's about blaming Labour for the consequences of a Tory disaster. I think it's about harbouring a deep resentment against Labour for not doing more to stop it, But people are intelligent enough, I think, not to mix up the two sets of responsibilities. But as I said at the start, I think the worry from a Labour point of view would be, if people like me feel alienated from Labour, something has gone wrong. I am the most natural Labour voter in the country, and yet I didn't vote Labour at the last election, and I won't vote Labour at the next election if the situation doesn't change. Doesn't matter in Liverpool. 85% in Labour in my constituency. Doesn't matter in Liverpool, but it will matter in other places. So I don't think it's about people mixing up the blame and blaming Keir for Johnson's mess. I think it's about people feeling so alienated over a period of time that they just cease to be Labour voters or supporters for the rest of their lives. And I think that's really not very desirable. Is he going to demand a public vote before January? And if I were him, I wouldn't be wasting my effort to try and demand a public vote either. I think if I were Keir, I would be doing everything I possibly could to be pointing a huge finger at Johnson and the Tories, saying they own this and everything that happens belongs to them and nobody else. This is entirely their responsibility. I think that would be the focus of my political effort if I were Keir in this situation. is creating and not leaving the narrative to be created in January or February or March, creating the narrative right now. This is Johnson's Brexit, and Johnson has got his way 100%, and everything that happens is now his responsibility.
Brilliant.